Well, then we'd better get going. Now we're recording. Well, anyway, it's great to have you here, Sheila. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk to the Socialist History Society event. And
Pleasure.
well, I think I'll leave it to you to just say what you're going to say. But I'll just point out that this is, if you're not, all of those attending, if you're not members of Socialist History Society, then do please become a member. And in the meantime, I'll hand over to you, Sheila, to talk about your books, which have been an inspiration, certainly to me.
Thank you. It's a bit daunting. I feel as though I'm kind of going through some portals into the history of socialist history, which makes me feel even more archaic than I'm feeling at the moment. But I'm going to talk about a book, Reasons to Rebel, My Memories of the 1980s, which is published by Merlin, and which is the third of two previous ones that done at different times. One is, I don't see, that's called Promise of a Dream, and that was about the 1960s when I was a young person. And that's Verso. And Daring to Hope followed after quite a long gap, which is about the 1970s. And that's published also by Verso. And this one, which I'm talking about today, is Reasons to Rebel, My Memories of the 1980s. And I have to say that I don't have plans to go on into any further bits of my life, because I think these periods are more interesting than my later years. The Promise of a Dream and Daring to Hope described really coming of age in the 1960s and developing socialist ideas, coming as I did from an extremely conservative background. And it's followed in the 1970s by a very intense and personal immersion in the movement for women's liberation, and that the main theme that's covered. I continued to be a socialist, but a group of us called ourselves socialist feminists at that time because we were felt we were linked to the left and to the women's liberation movement. Well, the overarching theme of Reasons to Rebel is less cheery, really. It's about the dogged resistance that I and thousands of others mounted against the right-wing conservatism of Margaret Thatcher and her government. And this might seem to have a rather grim air to it, but in fact, though my memories of the 1980s do include sadness, which both personal and political, feelings of loss and frustration, along with the fact that there were many discouraging defeats in that decade. Those early years of the 1980s also contained excitement, fun, and chance of exploring broader horizons, geographically and intellectually. And through that time, I was also strengthened by many close friendships, the humour, and the shared sense of purpose that we continue to share as socialist feminists. Several local socialist societies were bringing people together as the 1970s drew to a close. And stimulated by meetings in London and Newcastle, in March 1979, Lynn Siegel, Hilary Wainwright, and I had put together a small but hefty booklet called Beyond the Fragments, Feminism and the Making of Socialism, which later was published by Merlin. In differing contexts, the three of us were preoccupied with changing how socialism was conceived and acted upon through a combination of feminist and grassroots perspectives. In the 1980s, it was a real shock to us because we hadn't encountered that kind of conservatism before. And the changes introduced by Margaret Thatcher's form of conservatism really battered left movements. They also disrupted working class people's livelihoods and pressed down on many groups who faced discrimination. So there was certainly no shortage of reasons to rebel. We thought that the previous kind of capitalism was not great, those of us on the left. And by the 1980s, we were simply appalled because we hadn't encountered that kind of extreme conservatism. So along with thousands upon thousands of others, I was opposing not just repressive laws, but the absolutely fundamental tenets of the new right. We were hanging on still, as the 80s began, to creative utopias, which had flourished in the 1960s and 70s. And we were seeking new ways of organizing and also, at the same time, new ways of relating to others. So the kind of liberatory sexual politics which came through women's movement and gay liberation were really attacking many kinds of inequality, which had been, it wasn't that they were completely ignored by the socialist left, but they hadn't been prioritized. And we wanted to give them equal priority with forms of class exploitation. We argued and wrote and campaigned and demonstrated and picketed. We established alternative cooperative projects. And we were able to secure some reforms, even in the 1980s, through local government. And I think that one of the reasons for a much more international awareness was that the difficulties we faced in Britain made us aware of the strengthening importance of international links. So all kinds of resourceful resistance did slow down the onslaught, but we were contending not simply with this doctrinal resolve of a right-wing government. We faced something larger and something that we couldn't vote out, which was a more ruthless kind of global capitalism geared to profits, which was prepared to dump hard-won reforms from the past, which actually we've been rather superior about in our younger years. I think my generation, which had started to get involved in politics when we were in our late teens, in the period of the late 1960s, in which we had a great, very, very hopeful ideas of what could be changed. So at the beginning of the 1980s, I write at the beginning of my book, Reasons to Rebel, which is the third, I guess the third one. Although I hadn't intended it to be. I mean, I hadn't got a plan when I wrote the first memoir that I was going to write two more, but I have been able to do these. And I think it was a sense that we still had the bounce of the period of the 70s, although there'd been defeats even at the end of the 70s. We hadn't known the kinds of defeats which people of an earlier generation had faced in the 1920s and 30s. We were known as, the ones of us who weren't in left groups, as the non-aligned. And we interacted with the small, relatively new revolutionary parties, with the Ecology Party in some cases, and with older institutions like the Labour and Communist parties. There were also, in that period, changes evident in the unions, partly because of pressure from social movements like gay liberation and women's liberation and movements against racism. But it was also partly because of grassroots militancy developing over the course of the 60s and 70s within the unions. And that was developing some innovative ways of organizing, like the shop stewards combine committees, which had emerged while activists were providing research through the trade union resource centers. So there was interconnections between people on the left in the trade union movement and people who were probably members of trade unions, but not primarily active within trade union politics, which would be people like myself. In 1982, encouraged by Hilary Wainwright, who was working on economic policy at the Greater London Council, which was led at that time by Ken Livingstone, who earned the nickname of Red Ken in the popular media. The media were, on the whole, pretty opposed to the GLC, but the GLC locally was in London was quite popular in many areas because of the practical reforms that the new kinds of left Labour councillors were beginning to institute. And Hilary Wainwright was working in the economic policy group. And one of the things that she was really centrally involved in doing was setting up a popular, it was called Popular Planning Unit. And we had the initials of the PPU. We used to be teased by some of the other members of the economic policy group they said that there was Dick Muscat, for example, called the Popular Planning Unit California, because he said we always looked far too happy. And actually, I think this was because Hilary turned out to be a rather good boss, in the sense that she always paid attention to what people were doing, but she didn't kind of go into the details, and she left people a great deal of leeway to devise and create and develop. Well, my job was to write down what was going on, to record it in a paper. And actually, I've got I think I've got them. Yes, it was called very hopeful. This is one. I think I got it in the right place. That's one of the things. It was called Jobs for a Change, and it was about partly defending local government, left local government, because Margaret Thatcher was furious about this source of resistance that was developing within local government. Jobs cuts, the crunch. So that's what we did. Me and John, helped by Joy, who came along as an administrator to help us. We produced this paper with the GLC's supplies department. And the supplies department was extraordinary. It had an amazing turnover, absolutely vast turnover, because it supplied all the the material for the schools in London, and was closely linked to the Inner London Education Authority. My job was actually not a total job in theory, although quite often I would be in the office at about 11 o'clock at night. But in theory, it wasn't I was meant to be half a job, which I was doing sharing with John Hoyland. And it meant that I had flexibility of time because my son was very young at that time. And I didn't think I could do a proper full-time job alone. And I'd worked closely with John Hoyland, who became the co-editor of Jobs for a Change. And we started a thing in the 1960s called Agitprop, which was a network to connect radical artists with left causes. And we'd also helped to produce the left paper Black Dwarf, which had been edited by Tariq Ali later on. Well, John and I were appointed shortly before Christmas, and we were meant to be informing Londoners about the GLC's research and projects and transposing our mix of rather anarchical efficiency into the popular planning unit, headed by Hilary at County Hall. I had no idea of the extent to which these things meant, what the kind of work I'd be doing. But I was only on this half-time job, and at the same time, I was meant to be developing an alternative economic strategy in which childcare and domestic labour were included, which Hilary had established the very foundations for. Well, there was a commitment because Hilary drafted a leaders report that was for Ken Livingstone to endorse, which he did, which included a commitment not simply to women's employment needs, but to domestic labour, the hidden labour in the home. And at that time, although it may sound quite old hat to people now, but it to include that in an economic strategy of a local government the size of London, which was, several million people at that time, was really an important innovation. And it was supported importantly, not only by Michael Ward, who was the member appointed to cover industry and employment, but also by Ken Livingstone. So it had power to do things. After a lot of wandering about in my life, I'd suddenly become a local government worker, and that was quite a surprise. I quickly picked up rumbles of hostility in County Hall to both the left Labour members and to us, who were, the term was enunciated with an astringent venom, political appointees. One day when I was sitting quietly in the ladies, I heard from my position on the toilet seat in one of the cubicles, a voice complaining about these political appointees, because some of the people who worked at the GLC loathed us. However, we also were supported by another sort of strata of people who worked at the GLC, and they were incredibly important. I remember a Christmas party when I first went to work there in the end of 1982, in which 3 young men described how they'd seen this absolutely terrible harridan called Hilary Wainwright, who'd been seen wearing dungarees held up by a safety pin at work. And this is considered absolutely appalling because, somebody who was in the past, who was head of some kind of section of the GLC, was never seen in dungarees. And just at that moment, Hilary arrived, bouncing with delight and declaring, look at my glitter. She was very excited because her younger sister had taught her how to put glitter on her eyelids, and she battered, I write that she battered her eyelids like Betty Boop to show me the fashionable accoutrements of purple, green, and gold sent by her younger sister. I smiled sweetly and announced to the young men, "This is Hilary." Hilary beamed broadly, and the three young men who'd talked about the harridan melted away into the night. So that was the beginnings of my extraordinary experiences in local government. I'd never really done anything like that before, or certainly after. But this development in local government was part of a lot of activity that still survived even in the early 80s. And in 1981, the Big Red Diary, I won't get, but I've got some at the back behind me, had a theme of utopias. And each week it was strewn with inspiring historical examples. At the back were 31 reassuring pages with long lists of diverse contemporary groupings, outlets and publications seeking visionary change. And I named a few of these in Reasons to Rebel. There was Bristol Black Women's Group, Greenpeace, Sheba, Feminist Publishers, Rank and File Teacher, Achilles Heel, the Journal, Cornwall Diggers Newsletter, and I can't pronounce, say, Orsa. I'm sorry, Scots, I probably pronounced it very badly, but this gives just some idea of the variety of different forms of activity. The people who might have been seeking alternative sustenance for body as well as mind were being also proffered by Beano Whole Food Shop in Leeds.
Did he hang up?
The sound gone? Now it's gone. I've just got Dan Kaplan written on the screen.
It's all right. I think it's
Come back.
gone now.
I can hear you. Yeah, I can hear you. Beano Whole Food Shop I was up to in Leeds, and radical bookshops like News from Nowhere, Liverpool Preston's Fly in Amber, and Liverpool News from Nowhere, Preston's Fly in Amber, London's Gaze the Word, and New Beacon Books were just some, along with the Caribbean campaigning poet and intellectual John La Rose. The survival of these disparate alternatives into the 80s testified that much had been accomplished and maintained, and the values they espoused implicitly were repudiating the depressing misconceptions that Margaret Thatcher's perspective was the only one conceivable. She was absolutely resolved that that should be the case, that she would wipe out any other misconceptions. And it was a real battle, and it was coming from all these different types of activities and movements. It was really that at the end of the 1970s that inspired myself, Hilary Wainwright, and Lynn Siegel to put together this book called Beyond the Fragments. And it came out of meetings through the socialist societies in Islington and also up in Newcastle, where Hilary had been living. So through Hilary and Lynn, I went to speak at the Socialist Society in Islington, and also up at the one in Newcastle as well. So these socialist societies were new growths, and they were trying locally to bring people together. So the stuff that we started to try and do through the GLC was really a different manifestation in a different context of trying to bring some of the things together, because they were all so diverse, and yet the radical intent and the opposition to Margaret Thatcher's policies were shared. I think that one of the other things was that because things got so grim, I think I mentioned this earlier, we were interested increasingly in international connections. And I was contacted through a woman called Kumari Jayawardena, who I hadn't ever met at that time, but who had written a book about feminism and third world countries, what were then called third world countries. It was really important to me when I read her book, and I did review it. And Kumari's husband happened to be the head of a research unit at in Helsinki, which had an incredibly pompous title, which was World Institute for Development Economic Research, and it was known as WIDER for short. It was a branch of the United Nations University, but it was a very different kind of organization, partly because of the influence of Kumari Jayawardena and supported by Lal Jayawardena, who is the director. Well, I got a mysterious telephone call from this thing called WIDER after the GLC ended. And I kept saying, but I'm not an economist. And the person on the other end of the phone was not taking any notice at all. I think when I heard it was this World Institute for Development Economic Research, you know, I'm a social historian, I wasn't an economist, but they absolutely persisted. And this is because Kumari was in Sri Lanka, an active socialist feminist, and she really galvanized me into an international context outside Britain. I went on a long trip to India and helped by a historian friend who was a socialist feminist in India, Radha Kumar. I learned about projects which organized poor women, including home workers who in the context of British unions were seen as absolutely unorganizable. However, in India, in the most difficult conditions, Rinana Jabvala, it was called the Self-Employed Women's Association. Well, the self-employed women were people who were working as home workers, sewing or making baskets, and they had several, thousands of members. I was responsible for organizing a meeting in 1990 on new ways of organizing around women's work in Helsinki. With that as the inspiration, Rinana Jabvala was one of the people who came. And so was a new friend of mine called Swasti Mitter, who I'd made contact with in the early 90s. And we'd edited a book called Dignity and Daily Bread together. So right through the 80s, I continued to give talks on feminism and socialism in several countries. I was moving about after the end of the GLC in Britain and Holland and Denmark, Ireland, United States, Canada, Greece, France, Spain, and India. And just that list is so mind-boggling to me now, because I don't think I would have been at all able to do it now. But I did at that time really gain a great deal from those international links. I also write in Reasons to Rebel about the ways in which we tried to follow up from Beyond the Fragments in Britain. And in the afterword, I list a series of questions that had accumulated from the 1980s and were left hanging as the context during the subsequent decades changed yet again. Behind these is a realization that there were not neat fixes providing trouble-free solutions on how to organize as a feminist or as a socialist in opposition to the status quo. And I fear that lesson has been imprinted even more deeply as the years have gone by. So I'm not sure really whether a new generation of rebels will find these retrospective memories useful, but I do suspect that they might, because the context that we were tussling was right the beginnings of that change with much more difficult circumstances, which now confronts a new generation. I'll stop there and see if there's questions. I've no idea whether you've even heard of this or have been able to read it, but I hope I've given you some taste of what it's about. It's about history, but it's through my personal lens and my own experience. Now I can't hear. Sound's gone.
No, it's all right.
There you are.
Myself. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. And yeah, let us find reasons, even more reasons to rebel now. You feel like that's the case. Have I got questions? I'm sure we've got lots. I've got a few hands up. Di, do you want to unmute yourself, and then Tara?
Hi, Sheila and everyone. Like you, I worked at the GLC, and I'm very aware of that. Felt like a very there was this kind of high point of optimism we had in the 70s of winning various battles, and then there was the GLC, and after that it was kind of downhill all the way. Well, not quite, but I wonder, I can't remember what you did after the GLC, both in way of employment and political activism, and what kinds of political activism you think were important then and continue to be important now, perhaps.
Should I reply now?
Would you what? Shall I collect a few? If I mean,
Yeah.
Tara had a question, so maybe I'll take Tara as well, and then come back to you. I can't see any hands up at the moment, but please feel free. Tara, do you want to put your question?
Hi, Sheila. Thank you for that. I just had a question. 1984, to me, one of the big things that happened was the miners' strike and the work around women, or the work women did around women against pit closures. And for me, moving to Bristol in about 1982 and 84, that was a kind of massive, especially as a feminist and a socialist. And I'm just surprised you haven't mentioned that as part of, that period. And I just wondered if you had any comments about that, or whether that was just part of every other industrial kind of things that were going on. But, for me, the other big thing, because I was in the Labour Party around black sections and trying to coordinate, my feelings around feminism with race and stuff. So I am quite interested what your perspective. I know you've alluded to other groups like, the gay and the other liberation movements as well. But I'd be interested to hear a bit more about that.
Thank you. Yes, Sheila.
The miners' strike was actually it was kind of personally important, because I happened to have a friend who was working at Northern College in Yorkshire, Jean McCrindle, and because she was it was located in Barnsley. She was teaching trade union students there. So a lot of the women were involved with Women Against Pit Closures. And so, yes, in the miners' strike was extraordinary because actually the women from the Women Against Pit Closures came to the GLC, along with many people, including a lot of international trade unionists and activists. So there was it became a place of convergence where they came to talk to Ken Livingstone, but because through this my friendship with Jean McCrindle, I heard a lot about what was going on in Barnsley, and we all were really inspired by those enormous gatherings, which was great demonstrations, and this mass activism of working class women, which as socialist feminists, we'd always been wanting to happen in previous eras. And it did occur in the 1970s in the miners' strikes, but it was on a much, much greater scale in the 1980s. And so there were growths of awareness and consciousness and activism that were different from what had gone before.
Yeah, Di Parkins is pointing out that Women Against Pit Closures had a caravan outside the GLC, which is interesting.
Yes, yes.
Did you have a response to Di?
Actually, the miners were collecting also at the GLC, and one miner from Wales, Di Donovan, became quite a good friend, and we're still in contact through that from the miners' strike.
Did you want to respond to Di as well about what happened, what you did for after the GLC?
Oh yeah, I had a bit of I had some savings, but I had a kind of economic crisis because I'd been putting little bits of money together from writing for things like New Society or the New Statesman, but it didn't really amount to an income. And I was mainly supporting my son Will as well, who was a child. So it was quite difficult as the 80s went on. And it was this international connection to wider that became the means by which I survived into the 90s. And then in the mid-90s, I finally got a proper job because Will, my son, was older and I felt I could leave. So I went to up to Manchester University to work there.
Thank you. I've got a question from Inga. And anybody else? We'll start with you, Inga, if you can unmute yourself.
Thank you, Linda. I gave up history at primary school level, and it's only really been in the last 20 or 30 years I've had a bottom-up, excuse the expression.
Yeah.
That's best. I met you, Linda, briefly at an art class before I got active, and you were showing me some amazing photographs you took in Detroit. I think it must have been in the days before mobile phones and the internet and everything. But the last few years, I've been active at last through my art, doing drawings of the Palestine protests and as much as I can to support Just Stop Oil and other movements that the youngsters, it's mainly the youngsters that I'm thinking about, because I've sort of got a bit of a blind spot. I was sort of aware of what was going on, all the stuff you guys were intimately involved with, making history. And would you have a message for the amazing young students who are kind of being charged and banned from protesting at another difficult period for the left?
It is.
Bit of a broad question.
I mean, I'm not, as I'm in my early 80s, I'm not a very good person to talk about the experience.
Well, you have a lifetime history. I can't give them any advice because I've only been active since I turned 70.
Well,
A bit of a late developer.
one just, I mean, it doesn't sound very, glamorous, but Renanda Jambwala was a very wise person, the person who started with others, this Self-Employed Women's Association in India, and the odds against the women that the Self-Employed Women's Association it was organizing was so great. But she had this thing about keep on keeping on, and it's not very cheerful. But that in the difficult times, I think that's simply what people have to do, because those things that carry on in some form, so that people can kind of hear them, even if they're rather small and don't always win, are things that people will pick up, younger people will pick up. And then when times change and circumstances change, people can enlarge on the small things that were actually done. So some kind of continuity and memory feels incredibly important. There's a lot of red heart suddenly.
Nice.
That was a kind of mythical arrival. Red hearts of hope coming.
Sheila, Taram had a question, also talked about the black sections at the moment and the importance of, and I wondered whether you wanted to say something in response to that.
Well, I think that has really magnified and grown to be much more significant and important. And perhaps the encouragement of the GLC could have assisted that, because for the first time, really, as a group of basically mainly, white Labour representatives were really committed and serious in their support for those movements in London, because they were incontestably talking about things which needed to be listened to by people who were socialists. It wasn't that socialists were opposed, it was just that, it's been so difficult, because nowadays I would think that people see issues to do with sexism or racism as more obviously connected to the left than class. And I think it's so difficult to keep all of the things together, that I think that keeping them together is the really important thing to try and do. And I think that that's something that I've always felt and feel it's much stronger once you get those connections. As soon as you get people recognizing each other in different movements, you begin to get something that actually grows into something more challenging than all the single protests that come. It's very easy for capital to sort of isolate each individual strands of radical protests. It's when people are saying we're together that it becomes much more difficult for them to do that.
I've got two hands up now. Francis and Duncan. Shall I go? Francis, did you want to put a question to Sheila?
Yeah, thanks, Sheila. Very, very interesting. I was thinking about the what you were saying about the GLC, because I was in London at the time, and I remember we used to go up to County Hall, where the minor support group that met there, and being met at the entrance for all those chaps in those really smart black jackets and ties and all that sort of thing, being ushered into a minor support group was a kind of slightly weird experience. But I mean, there was a massive amount of material produced in this kind of kind of upsurge of municipal socialism, of which the GLC was probably one of the most prominent exponents. We then had the rather sad coda of municipal Trotskyism about a year or two afterwards. And since then, it's all pretty much evaporated. So what I was wondering in relation to what you were saying about your connections abroad was, do you think any of that work and any of those ideas kind of like had any kind of afterlife outside of this country, or did municipal socialism kind of evaporate almost everywhere in the 1980s, after the 1980s?
Honestly, I'm not sure of the answer to that, but I know the GLC did influence a lot of people in many different countries, because they actually arrived coming through the I mentioned in the book that one time you would kind of see a whole load of gondoliers who were on strike in Italy coming through the door. So that, you know, that there would be very many different people from different countries who would come, and also from what we then called third world countries, the countries that were developing.
Yeah, I agree. It was a great attractor. And I mean, in the architects department, there was a great mixture of nationalities coming from everywhere. I mean, it was almost like half of Europe wanted to work in the GLC. But, Duncan, did you want to say something?
Yes, thank you. I mean, marvelous reading the book, Sheila. I mean, it brought back lots of memories, as did the two previous volumes. I mean, I worked in local government in London through the period that you're studying, but for Lambeth and Newham, both relatively progressive boroughs at the time, and very closely with the GLC. But what I think we need to remember is just how empowered local government was in those days, even through the early years of the Thatcher regime. Both in terms of the resources and the flexibility we had to undertake a whole range of initiatives in terms of both improving services and, in the case of the GLC as a strategic body, well beyond the sort of normal statutory duties. And just the contrast with now, with where local government is so disempowered, where, you know, councillors who get elected to try and do good things are just basically putting through, making decisions between, you know, different forms of cuts. And not actually really even be able to maintain basic services, never mind do the kind of interesting things that the GLC and some authorities did. I mean, what I'm just interested in your comments on the change in this situation, and also the fact that, you know, the government as it is, the Labour government, really doesn't seem to understand the importance of the local state in engaging people and doing interesting things, as well as keeping the basic services going. And you know, I just find it so disappointing that there is just no recognition of how important local politics and local political engagement can be, and how we can actually use the state for positive purposes, which seems very, very difficult and challenging now. I'm sorry if that's pessimistic, but, you know, we've really gone so far backwards over the last 50 years.
I have to confess that I'm not very well informed on other countries and the extent to which some of these things may have survived in other countries. I mean, I did go around speaking in Greece and Canada and America after the GLC on what we've been doing, and there certainly was interest from people. Well, particularly actually, I would say in Canada actually.
Did you want to comment on Duncan's pessimism about local government?
It is. It's not easy to be that cheery now, I don't think. But I don't think there's ever time when things are actually not happening. It's just that they don't become visible. It's a lack of shared visibility, which I think is quite disempowering. I feel at the moment, but that may be just because I've got older and gotten a bit more tired. I don't know. It's very difficult to separate myself from my subjective situation.
But maybe we could turn his pessimism on its head and say that local government, certainly in the 80s, was essential, really, also for opposing what was going on in the central government. And probably we might say the same today, that plays a vital role, even if it's weak.
I wonder, has anybody, do people know Winifred Holtby's book, South Riding? It just popped into my head when you were saying that, because she, I quote in, I think in Reasons to Rebel, there's a great quote of a vision of what local government can do. It was written long, long before the GLC.
Yeah, yeah. Andrea's got a question, and then Riyadh.
I just want to say thank you. When I was a student, my English was not really good. Yeah, I was sitting with your articles in English, with the book for the translation. Only thank you, thank you, thank you.
That's very moving.
Riyadh.
Hi there. I actually work in local government in London and have done for too long. But I do remember when I started as a teenager in the mid to late 80s in Islington, as a very young person still in my late teens, you definitely felt you were in a very militant, very forward-thinking, sort of progressive, politically quite radical place in local government. But I was also aware of, we'd had 10 years of Thatcherism by that point, and it was a kind of politicization that was fairly embattled, that had experienced quite a number of defeats, and what you were hearing at union meetings wasn't necessarily what you were experiencing in the wider society in terms of what you'd read in the newspapers. And there was a big disconnect, even for me as a young teenager, between the politics, I guess at the radical end, and what you saw once you stepped outside of a very rambunctious union meeting in the council chamber and connected with what was going on in Thatcher's Britain and the wider world, and the sorts of problems that you're having to deal with as a kind of housing officer for people who are already starting to face the worst of those Thatcherite policies. And I suppose the curve has been of kind of steady decline, and it was already in a pretty embattled state in the 80s, and it's been a story of marginalization by capitalist power in this country, aided and abetted by the sort of Labour parties under Kinnock and consequent leaders that have been instrumental in sidelining the left. And I just thought, in terms of looking back at that period of your own sort of biography and that wider history, whether you think there's anything that you would have done, approached differently now, looking at yourself, looking back, or those around you in the wider movement, when you're thinking about people picking up this book and consequent generations. I thought the point made about the defeats of the 20s, that in some sense there'd been maybe 40 years from particularly the period after the war, of a very strong left, and then just suddenly to experience the ruthlessness of the right and not having much by way of defense, I thought was a strong point. So I just wondered, looking back, do you see any sort of missed opportunities?
Oh.
Shall I take another comment from Martin before you before you respond to that, Sheila? We can't hear you, Martin. You're muted.
I'm sorry I joined the meeting a bit late, so please excuse me if what I have to say has been covered by other people. but I was rather disappointed to see that the narrow focus of people's contributions is often very much about local councils, government policies and things like that. I've been looking back at the city of Cambridge, which is where I was involved with things in the 1980s, through the community, anarchist community newspaper that I was involved with, Grapevine. And it's amazing when you look back how much activity there was in the community. It wasn't the local government that was making the running. It was the people in the local community setting up free schools, fighting against redevelopment in the centre of Cambridge.
I'm totally aware of that. I am completely aware of that. I mean, I write about that in Reasons to Rebel, and I did actually read out some of those grassroots groups. But the problem was in the 80s that all that diverse local activity was not able to concertedly put an opposition, and the left groups also, the manner in which they operated didn't appeal to a lot of young people.
Well, that was one of the reasons why there was such a lot of activity within the community, because
yes,
traditional left.
I was involved in Hackney, yes, I know.
And I think really this focus that we have on local government, national government policies, while it's important because it creates the framework within which we're often having to work, it takes us away from what we do as individuals, what we do as groups, and the answer to the terrible direction that the country and the world seems to be going is to do things ourselves, to start the change ourselves.
That local government was some kind of thing to be just seen as a rubber stamp. I really do not believe that. I've always been active in things that were local. And
This
I've
wasn't
never been in such a thing that was covering several million people. But the thing was, what I'm trying to say is that when things get hard, you do actually need more than the local initiatives. And because London, you know, being, it was used to call it, what was it called? That monstrous Wen or something, I think, Daniel Defoe. But I mean, it was a great big conglomerate of people. And therefore, there was a power in the local government that couldn't exist in other places. But the problem was that we couldn't get a more concerted resistance to the right-wing ideas. And they have resurfaced depressingly in our time, haven't they, really?
This wasn't meant to be a personal criticism, but just a criticism of comments that people have made in the discussion of which I've seen. But I do think that we have a tendency every 3 or 4 years to stop the activity that we're engaged in and put all our eggs into electing representatives, which then go on not to represent us in so many occasions. And I'm not trying here to dismiss the steps that were made by some councils to provide a very supportive environment within which local activity could take place and could grow and could expand. But I think what we're always in danger of forgetting about is that it doesn't start with them, it starts with us. Yeah. And that's what the message of horizontalism and organisation from below needs to be put around now, because we know that we're not going to get anything that we want from Starmer. Are we going to just sit back and wait? Or we know that local government is being changed. Why don't we propose our own assemblies and things like this as a counteract? Start with a discussion of what's happening in local government, and let's put forward some proposals for actions ourselves. I'm not going to try and lay out a blueprint, but it's just that I see this tendency from everybody, and I've been through it myself, you know, but
sorry, I've got other people who want to put a point too, so can you?
Yeah, I'll stop straight away. So I hadn't noticed anybody else's hands going up because it's against the wrong colour background. Sorry if I said too much.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I think we get your point. Barbara.
Yes, I mean, sort of what Martin said has prompted me to, I was wondering about whether I should say what I'm about to anyway. And as a fellow anarchist, I was in London at the time that Sheila's been talking about. And I did think that although compared certainly with what we have now, and in many ways the GLC funding for different groups was welcome. It was a sort of double-edged sword. And for instance, I was involved as a feminist in Haringey Women's Centre, which we set up as a grassroots, something that came out of the community. And then we had quite an emphasis on women, encouraging women and supporting women to move away from their traditional roles was one of the things we were very keen on. And then we got GLC funding. We got a management committee of not exactly the great and the good, but sort of respectable women involved in various jobs and so on. And it wasn't long before we had a creche and a washing machine in the Women's Centre. And these were things that were really important for women in the community and certainly should have been provided. But we found that we were sort of supporting and providing those things instead of focusing on things where women wanted to be something different and not somebody that was looking after the kids and doing the washing. So I think, I think it was a bit of a double-edged sword. And what's happened since then, when you ever get funding for any sort of community group or campaign group, it definitely waters down the radicalism. And yet you need the support to do things. And yet I think it does detract from the rebellion, if you like. So I have mixed feelings about it, but I think it's interesting to discuss that. Thank you.
Did you want to respond?
About the washing, one of the things that I was quite involved with was a group of women who formed a cooperative laundrette. And that was one of the things that the GLC was funding. And there's a very funny thing that a woman, when I went back there after the GLC had been closed down, this thing had been taken over by this cooperative laundrette had been taken over by the local council, and it was under the Arches, and it was in West London. I remember going there, and there was this amazing thing, and there's a woman came in with her pushing the pram, and she said, "Oh, I've got a book about the GLC," and she opened the pram up, and underneath the mattress of her pram that she was pushing the toddler in, she pulled out this thing. It was a picture of Michael Ward, who was the GLC councillor, with "There is an alternative" put blazoned across the cover. So she somehow or other, one of the GLC pamphlets had somehow gone under the pram of the women's washing, cooperative washing centre in West London.
Nadine, you have.
Yeah, can I just come back to the last two speakers? I was around in the 70s and 80s and since then. And I think Sheila talked about In and Against the State briefly. When we talked about In and Against the State, it was a really political decision because a lot of us before the GLC had been involved in very local voluntary organisations in our communities. But it appeared to us that the burgeoning kind of left Labour Party in particular did offer an opportunity to get more resources for the very people we were working with. And I went on to work in local government and also the GLC. And I think the other thing that was really important, because I worked on race and policing at the GLC, is that we needed the strength of a huge organisation like the GLC to actually make it safe for the Black community and the Irish community to actually come out to festivals and to come out and raise the issues about policing. And so there were lots of reasons why we needed the local state on our side. And I think it didn't detract from the work that Irish people and Black people were doing in their communities, but it gave them another way of tackling the wider state. And I think when I worked in the central unit of GLC, and when we did research, it was festivals, it was standing up for different communities, which actually got the most kind of ticks when you asked people what they thought about the GLC. And they were able to, lots of Irish people said to me, no one's ever taken our community seriously except the police. We felt scared to talk about being Irish. And Black people said the same thing. And I think that's the use of the state was really important to protect those people and also to help them use their own identities. But we were well aware of the problems of the state, which of course have come right round now to hit us in the face. But I think the end against the state was a very conscious political decision by people to see whether they could use both the community and the state.
I know it's such an old argument on the left, but I think somehow the chance to make some kind of combination among changed manifestations of the state and popular movements from below is important. But similarly, you know, the links to institutions like trade unions also, which can become quite top down unless they're constantly corrected. I mean, there's a process of exhaustion that probably takes place in older age. Can you hear me still? Have I gone quiet?
Yes, well, I'm just looking for a hand and I can't see one.
Yeah. I just want to mention Gail Lewis, who there's very little written anywhere about people who were active in the 80s. And Gail Lewis had been active in Black politics before she came to the GLC. And you can just see this. This is a book called Truth, Dare or Promise, Girls Growing Up in the 50s. And it's edited by Liz Heron. And it was an old Virago book. But there's Gail in her books, who was a very active person in South London.
Sheila, can I just ask you about the whole process of writing about the 70s and 80s? And I mean, how did you keep a diary or what?
Oh, I kept only these kind of diaries, which are in a box. This is these kind of diaries, which aren't like proper journals. They're just, you know, ordinary. Here's a 1984. I think I've got big red diary, which some oldie folk would remember. And then I've got the GLC ones. And then I've got one from India, from the Self-Employed Women's Association. So I did have these kind of diaries, but they weren't expressing deep thoughts or anything. They were just, but they were absolutely crucial because by reading these diaries, they brought memories back. You know, just a little jotting of something, and that was what I did. I didn't really. I mean, I've never kept systematically any kind of journal. I've had several attempts in which I embark on my deepest thoughts, but then I always give up, really. And usually just the things that get written down at times when I'm fed up. Some guys disappeared that I liked, so that was some kind of cause for gloom in my youth.
But did you didn't do any kind of archival type research or documents at the time, or?
I kept everything. I absolutely kept everything, and I gave it to most of the stuff to the Women's Library. And I know that because I've just happened to have been in Nottingham. sort of I'd got this virus, but before I collapsed, I was in Nottingham, and the Women's Liberation Group's been fantastic there in documenting the stuff that the Nottingham Women's Liberation Group did. They've really got a very good archival collection. So I think that, I mean, I have never researched it, but there must be those collections around the country. The one that I always contributed to myself was Women's Library, because I was really encouraged to do that by the archivist.
Yeah, I mean,
Gillian Murphy really encouraged me to do that.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
they took boxes and boxes and boxes of everything away, because I obsessively kept things, knowing that it's the most ephemeral things. You know, the tiny anarchist group that appears somewhere, or the little Women's Liberation Group. And if they've got some kind of record, that's just invaluable to people, because all that memory gets lost as we age.
well, it's a question of, yeah, constructing history, isn't it?
I really wanted to hope, I mean, in writing, that other people would start writing their accounts and documenting their memories, because, you know, one is inadequate. There's not very many things given that so many people were active through the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. You know, there's not that much stuff written about it.
No, it's true. True. It's beginning to have a revival, and it's interesting to understand why and how that and what impact that's going to have.
I hope it does.
Yes. Reason to rebel. Reasons to rebel. Have we got some more comments? Peter.
Hi, Andrea.
I can see a hand from Peter Brannan. Did you want to unmute?
Sorry, I'm Julia Brannan. My computer.
I thought you didn't look like Peter.
So, on that last point, I mean, it's just an aside, really, that if the records weren't kept, then, you know, you're not part of the history. And as part of my own sort of recording, not a memoir or anything, but I became a social scientist, and my early years were before I got back into work, were up in Newcastle on Tyne, living amongst mining communities. And then I moved to Bradford, where I had 2 small children, was at home, and joined the Bradford Women's Liberation Movement. And, you know, a few years ago, I was trying to find some records of that. And you know, I knew key people in it, all of whom have subsequently died or I couldn't find. But then there seemed to be no records. And actually at the time, you know, it was so momentous, you know. We met in the pub and got thrown out of the pub because of our seditious talk, and it was very much a socialist. We didn't call ourselves feminists at all, women's group, and you know, it was quite big, and we demonstrated. I remember Margaret Thatcher, when she was Secretary of State for Education, she came to the town hall, and we did a free, you know, she was abolishing free school milk, and we sat in the
milk snatcher.
we sat up
milk snatcher
on hall and from the gallery, and my son, who was about, I don't know, 10 months old, started bawling his head off, and there was an article in the Guardian about how you know, these unruly young people in the gallery, and even babies were interrupting. And all of that, you know, richness, if you like, was lost. And then after that, I moved to the south of England to a small town, which was in which the only party or political movement in town was the Tory party. So I started a Labour Party, but I said we were not having any organisation. You know, we weren't having any officers or any hierarchy, and the local constituency were very alarmed. But when the party grew, and we were quite sizable in number, they seemed to accept that we, you know, we could have our own rules and so forth. And after that, you know, I buried my life in researching other people's lives. But you know, that was foundational for my own life. And you know, it took me from the northeast of England through the northwest, through and of course London, very much London based. And I think quite a lot of not all of it by any means, as you've already said this evening, but a lot of if you go to an exhibition based on archival material, it's often from around London. And you know, it's such a shame when records aren't kept, because then you know, you're not part of the history anyway.
Yes, well, that's I mean, that's this emphasis in Nottingham. I don't know how is what the situation is in other places, because I've never encountered people who were so, I mean, they were really committed to that archive and keeping it, and it's certainly very impressive. In Nottingham. There must be other ones in other places, but I mean, I can't, you know, I can't get around so much now. So I'm hoping that younger people will dig it all out.
Anyway, thank you.
Yeah, this does point to the importance also of oral history, I think.
Yeah.
Sheila, did you have any other responses to this? I can't see any more hands up.
Oh, that's people are getting tired.
So trouble will be just looking at these boxes. Have we got some more comments, questions for Sheila? Have you got a kind of last reflection, if you like, on the difference between, you know, your two books? These, you must have a real view now of the 70s as in contrast in a way to the 80s.
The problem is that once I've written things, I find it, I don't know, it's so strange reading it again, because it's like some sort of echo coming back. So I have a bit of a resistance to, I should sit down and read one after the other to see whether they do connect or interact, but I haven't actually felt like doing that. I've been reading kind of historical novels to escape from the present at the moment.
I do have a hand from Elaine.
Hello. Yeah, I moved to Winchester from the north with my late husband, because he worked for the Ministry of Defence at the Royal Army Pay Corps in Winchester. He was it was when the big mainframe, the big mainframes. We didn't have computers, small computers. We had big mainframes.
Wow.
To pay for the army personnel, you know. And he was a programmer, you see. And yeah, and I got very much involved with in Winchester. We had a CND in Winchester, and we I did the Labour Party as well. I joined the local Labour Party. I used to go canvassing and with them as well, and delivering leaflets. Very well, and we had lots of members as well.
I've just seen a message from Irene Fick, who I haven't seen for
right. Okay.
Saying bye.
Oh yeah, yeah.
Anyway, carry on. I'm very sorry to interrupt you.
Oh, that's all right. Yeah. So, and I've even got a photo. I've even got a picture of when of walking. We were all walking with the all the members and all, and that. I don't know if I've still got it, if I dare to show it you.
Okay. Well, I think we're beginning to wind up now, Sheila. And I think would like to thank you very much indeed. That's been, I mean, you've certainly inspired everyone, or me anyway, to really look at both your books and well, all your work really, and
write your memories.
No, and to carry on the fight, which is what we all have.
Yes, and I was also a member of the Cooperative Party. We used to go to conferences in London. It's really good.
I mean, I wonder if people, if the older people who are talking remember when we were young. If there were older,
the Hampshire County Labour Party we had as well, a Hampshire County Labour Party.
Yeah, because the older people in the 60s and 70s, their memory went back to, the 1900s. So there were people that I met, like a suffragette called Florence Exton Han, who had been a trade unionist when she was young. Margaret Busby, bye. Florence Exton Han was a trade unionist and a suffragette. And when I met her, it completely exploded my rather prejudiced attitude to the suffragettes. I'd seen them in a conventional way as being all very posh. And when I met Florence Exton, and I realized that it was actually very different for quite a lot of women who participated in suffrage, and it reorientated the way I saw the history of suffrage. And I started looking for more working class women involved in suffrage.
Well, thank you. I think we're going to draw to an end there, now, and again, thank you very much, Sheila, and everybody else for coming. Thank you.
Thanks very much for coming.
I think Duncan just wants a last word.
Yes, no, thanks very much, Sheila. Not so much having a last word as co-chair of the society. I just wanted to draw attention to our next meetings. We tend to meet about once a month online and sometimes face to face. So have a look at our website, Socialist History Society. But the next meeting is on the 5th of March, 7 p.m. online, and is Leila Khalili speaking on imperial politics in the Indian Ocean. In April, 3rd of April, we have James Crossley speaking on A.L. Morton. We then have our annual general meeting at Marks Memorial Library, where we actually see each other in real life on the 3rd of May. And then on the 17th of June, we have Philippa Bennett on rewilding William Morris on the 17th of June. So have a look at our website. That's the details of the next session. And as Linda said at the beginning, if you're not a member, please do join. You get our Socialist History Journal, which is just about to come out. The next issue is on its way, together with newsletters and a couple of occasional publications a year. So do join. We're a membership organisation. We like our members to be involved rather than just listen to talks, though we, of course, always welcome you at our talks, but we'd like you to participate in the activities of the society more widely.
Thank you, and good night, everyone, and Sheila.
Bye. And bye-bye to Mehmet and Lois, who popped up just while people were speaking. And thank you very much for asking me.
Thank you.
And